On a quiet morning in Chicago's suburbs, a routine act of trust would unravel into one of the most consequential criminal investigations in American history. My name is Mike. Welcome to The Scary Secret. If you like stories like these, please like and subscribe. We appreciate all your support. Now, on with the show. In the early 1980s, the Chicago metropolitan area was a patchwork of tight-knit neighborhoods, commuter routines, and everyday rituals that revolved around family, work, and health. Over-the-counter medicine was woven into that daily life, used without hesitation and purchased without fear. Among the most familiar products on pharmacy shelves was extra-strength Tylenol, manufactured by Johnson & Johnson and marketed as a reliable solution for headaches, fevers, and minor pain. It was a household staple, trusted by millions, and widely considered safe. At the time, product tampering was not a dominant concern for consumers or regulators. Bottles were sealed, but the idea that someone might deliberately interfere with medication after it left the factory was not something most people contemplated. Pharmacies, grocery stores, and convenience shops operated on the assumption that what arrived from manufacturers would reach customers unchanged. That assumption would soon be challenged. On September 29, 1982, in Elk Grove Village, a northwest suburb of Chicago, 12-year-old Mary Kellerman woke that morning feeling unwell, complaining of cold-like symptoms. Her parents administered extra-strength Tylenol, following the same routine countless families relied on during illness. Within hours, Mary collapsed. Despite emergency efforts, she did not survive. At the time, her sudden death was shocking but unexplained, initially attributed to natural causes. No one yet suspected a connection to the medicine cabinet. Later that same day, in Arlington Heights, another family faced an abrupt and devastating loss. Adam Janis, a 27-year-old postal worker, returned home after work complaining of chest pain and discomfort. He reached for extra-strength Tylenol, a familiar and trusted choice. Shortly after ingesting the medicine, Adam collapsed. He was transported to a nearby hospital where he was pronounced dead. The speed and severity of his decline puzzled medical staff, but there was still no immediate indication of foul play. As relatives gathered at the Janis family home to grieve, tragedy struck again. Adam's brother, Stanley Janis, and Stanley's wife, Teresa Janis, both complained of headaches. In the midst of shock and mourning, they took capsules from the same Tylenol bottle Adam had used. Within minutes, both collapsed. Emergency responders arrived to the scene that defied comprehension. Stanley and Teresa Janis did not survive. By the end of that day, 3 members of one family were gone, along with a young girl in a neighboring suburb. At first, authorities viewed these deaths as isolated medical emergencies, but physicians and hospital staff began to notice striking similarities. Each person had ingested extra-strength Tylenol shortly before collapsing. Toxicology tests were ordered, and medical examiners began to share information across jurisdictions. As the night turned into the morning of September 30th, Cook County officials identified a common factor that changed everything. Capsules taken from the victims' homes were tested and found to contain potassium cyanide, a fast-acting poison not used in any legitimate pharmaceutical process. The discovery transformed a series of unexplained deaths into a criminal crisis. The Cook County Medical Examiner's Office alerted local law enforcement, the Illinois Department of Public Health, and federal authorities. The Federal Bureau of Investigation became involved as the scope of the threat became clear. This was not a manufacturing error. The capsules showed signs of deliberate tampering with poison added after the medication had been packaged and distributed. As news spread through internal channels, officials faced an urgent question. How many contaminated bottles were already in circulation? Pharmacies across the Chicago area had sold countless units of extra-strength Tylenol. Investigators needed to move quickly to prevent further loss of life. That same day, a fifth victim was identified. Paula Prince, a 35-year-old flight attendant, was found dead in her Chicago apartment. An open bottle of extra-strength Tylenol sat nearby. Testing confirmed the presence of cyanide. Shortly afterward, a sixth victim, Mary Reiner of Winfield, Illinois, was connected to the same cause. Within a span of days, 7 people across the Chicago area had died after taking the same medication. Investigators from local police departments, Cook County authorities, and federal agencies began retracing the path of the contaminated bottles. They interviewed family members, coworkers, pharmacists, and store employees. Cashiers were asked to recall recent Tylenol purchases. Pharmacists provided inventory records and delivery schedules. Investigators documented where each bottle had been purchased, noting that they came from different stores and different batches, ruling out a single point of manufacture. The evidence pointed toward a chilling conclusion. Someone had removed bottles from store shelves, tampered with the capsules, and returned them to circulation. This realization shifted the focus from quality control to criminal profiling. The act required planning, anonymity, and access to multiple retail locations. Public health officials faced a parallel challenge: how to warn the public without causing panic. Initial advisories urged residents of the Chicago area to avoid extra-strength Tylenol. Within hours, those warnings expanded nationwide. Johnson & Johnson issued urgent recalls, pulling millions of bottles from shelves across the United States. It was one of the largest product recalls in history. As investigators worked through the first days of the case, uncertainty dominated every decision. There was no suspect, no witness who had seen tampering occur, and no clear motive. What they did have was a rapidly growing understanding that the crime was unprecedented in scale and impact. It had turned a trusted consumer product into a weapon and transformed everyday routines into sources of fear. By the end of the first week, Chicago residents were scrutinizing medicine bottles, avoiding capsules, and questioning assumptions that they had never before challenged. Law enforcement agencies established task forces, evidence rooms filled with seized products, and tip lines began receiving calls from across the country. The investigation was only beginning, but already it had reshaped public awareness and corporate responsibility in ways that would echo far beyond Chicago. The Tylenol murders were no longer just a local tragedy. They were a national alarm, signaling that most ordinary moments of daily life could be exploited in extraordinary ways. In the final days of September 1982, Chicago awoke to a city gripped by uncertainty. The confirmation that extra-strength Tylenol capsules had been deliberately poisoned triggered an immediate and unprecedented response. Law enforcement agencies moved from quiet coordination to full-scale mobilization. Local police departments across Cook County worked alongside state officials, while federal resources were brought in to address what was now considered a nationwide threat. The Federal Bureau of Investigation established a major investigative presence in the Chicago area. Agents began working in coordination with the Illinois State Police and the Cook County Sheriff's Office, focusing on two parallel objectives: preventing further deaths and identifying whoever was responsible. Evidence rooms quickly filled with seized bottles of Tylenol collected from homes, stores, and warehouses. Each bottle was logged, photographed, and tested. Investigators determined early on that the tampering had not occurred during manufacturing. Capsules from the victims' bottles came from different production batches, processed at different times and facilities. That evidence redirected the investigation outward, toward retail locations. Someone had accessed store shelves, opened sealed bottles, altered the contents, and returned them without being detected. Teams of officers and agents fanned out across the Chicago metropolitan area. Pharmacies, grocery stores, and convenience shops were visited one by one. Store managers were interviewed about their inventory procedures. Employees were asked whether they had noticed anyone lingering in aisles, returning items, or handling medication without purchasing it. Cash registers were reviewed for unusual refund activity. Surveillance footage was scarce, as most retail stores at the time did not have cameras focused on aisles. At the same time, investigators interviewed family members, coworkers, and acquaintances of the victims. In Elk Grove Village, Arlington Heights, Winfield, and Chicago itself, detectives retraced the victims' final days. They documented where each bottle had been purchased and when. Receipts, when available, were collected. The trail revealed a troubling pattern. The poisoned bottles came from multiple locations, eliminating the possibility of a single contaminated store. As public concern intensified, health officials issued urgent warnings advising consumers not to take capsule form medications. News outlets carried the story continuously, broadcasting press conferences and updates throughout the day. Tip lines were established, and calls flooded in from across the country. Some callers reported suspicious behavior in stores. Others expressed fear that similar tampering might have occurred elsewhere. Each tip had to be assessed, logged, and when possible, investigated. Within days, Johnson & Johnson announced a nationwide recall of all Tylenol capsules, pulling more than 30 million bottles from store shelves. Company executives cooperated closely with investigators, providing distribution records, manufacturing data, and internal security information. The recall cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars, but it was viewed as a necessary step to protect the public and restore trust. Investigators also began examining motive. The crime appeared random, with victims selected not for who they were, but for their access to a widely used product. There was no evidence of personal connection between the victims and any suspect. That randomness complicated profiling efforts. The act required forethought, access to poison, and the willingness to risk widespread harm without direct personal gain. In early October, a new development added another layer to the case. Authorities received a letter postmarked from New Jersey, addressed to Johnson & Johnson. The writer claimed responsibility for the poisonings and demanded $1 million to stop the attacks. The letter was turned over to the FBI, which analyzed handwriting, phrasing, and postal details. Investigators treated the threat seriously but remained cautious. At the time, there was no way to confirm whether the author was truly responsible or attempting to exploit the situation. The extortion letter led investigators to focus briefly on potential suspects connected to New Jersey. Among those examined was James William Lewis, a resident of New York who had lived in Chicago previously. Lewis was questioned extensively, and his background was scrutinized. While he was later convicted on unrelated charges tied to the extortion attempt, investigators were never able to definitively link him to the poisonings themselves. Meanwhile, evidence collection continued. Investigators conducted controlled tests to understand how easily bottles could be opened and resealed. They determined that the packaging used at the time could be manipulated without obvious signs of tampering. This finding would later influence sweeping changes in how medications were packaged and sold. Community fear remained high. Hospitals reported increases in emergency room visits from people worried about symptoms after taking medication. Schools sent notices home with students. Pharmacies removed entire categories of products from shelves. Everyday routines were disrupted as families questioned whether something as simple as a headache remedy could be trusted. Despite thousands of interviews and tips, the investigation struggled with a fundamental problem: the lack of witnesses. No one had been observed altering bottles. No fingerprints or physical evidence conclusively tied a suspect to the crime scene. The tampering had been done quietly, anonymously, and in public spaces where accountability was limited. As weeks passed, the immediate danger appeared to subside. No new deaths linked to Tylenol were reported after the recall. Yet the absence of further incidents did not bring closure. Investigators continued to pursue leads, analyze evidence, and revisit theories. Task forces remained active, knowing that the person responsible had never been identified. By the end of 1982, the Chicago Tylenol murders had already reshaped the nation's understanding of consumer safety. The investigation exposed vulnerabilities that few had considered and forced industry regulators and public to confront uncomfortable truths about trust and security. But for law enforcement, the central question remained unanswered. Someone had committed a crime that altered history, and they had done so without being caught. The hunt for answers would continue long after the headlines faded, leaving behind a case defined as much by what was never discovered as by what was painfully revealed. In the weeks after the Tylenol capsules were removed from store shelves, the Chicago area slowly began to breathe again. No new deaths were reported. Hospitals saw fewer emergency visits tied to medication concerns. For many families, daily routines cautiously resumed. Yet beneath the surface, the case remained wide open, unresolved, and deeply troubling. The person responsible had not been identified, and investigators were left with evidence that spoke loudly about what had happened, but said almost nothing about who had done it. As 1982 turned into 1983, task forces remained active. Federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation continued working alongside state and local authorities, reviewing tips and reassessing evidence. Thousands of leads had been logged, ranging from suspicious behavior in retail stores to individuals with access to toxic substances. Each was evaluated, prioritized, and in most cases eliminated. The sheer volume of information became both a resource and an obstacle. One of the central challenges investigators faced was the absence of a clear motive. The poisonings did not target a specific individual, group, or institution in any personal sense. The victims had no known connection to one another beyond geography and timing. That randomness made it difficult to narrow suspect profiles. The crime appeared to be about impact rather than identity, about creating fear rather than settling a grievance. The extortion letters sent to Johnson & Johnson remained a focal point. Its author demanded money in exchange for stopping the attacks, and the letter's language suggested familiarity with the case details. Investigators traced the correspondence to James William Lewis, who was questioned extensively. Lewis admitted to sending the letter, but denied involvement in the poisonings. While he was later convicted on charges related to the extortion attempt, authorities were unable to prove that he had tampered with any Tylenol bottles. The distinction mattered. The murdered themselves remained legally and evidentially separate. As the criminal investigation continued, another transformation was already underway, driven not by police work, but by public response. The Tylenol case fundamentally altered how Americans viewed consumer safety. What had once been unthinkable became a recognized risk. In response, pharmaceutical companies began redesigning packaging almost immediately. Multiple layers of protection were introduced, including sealed boxes, foil barriers, and tamper-evident caps. These changes were not limited to Tylenol. They became industry standards, reshaping how medicine was sold worldwide. Regulators also took action. New federal laws were enacted to make product tampering a serious criminal offense, carrying severe penalties. Retailers revised return policies. Manufacturers invested heavily in safety engineering. The legacy of the case extended far beyond Chicago, embedding itself into everyday habits that would later be taken for granted, such as checking seals before opening a bottle. Yet for the families of the victims, progress in packaging and policy did not equal closure. Interviews conducted years later reflected a shared frustration, the sense that the crime had changed the world, but not answered the most personal question of all: who was responsible and why? Investigators revisited the case periodically as technology advanced. Evidence that once seemed inert was re-examined using improved forensic techniques. Handwriting analysis were updated. Chemical sourcing was reconsidered in light of new database tracking toxic substances. Despite these efforts, the core limitations remained. The poisoning had occurred in public spaces without witnesses, and the packaging at the time had offered little opportunity to capture trace evidence. Over time, theories emerged and faded. Some investigators believe the tampering was done by a single individual, methodical and careful. Others consider the possibility of copycat actions or false confessions muddying the waters. None of these theories produced definitive proof. The case resisted simplification. As years turned into decades, the Chicago Tylenol murders became a reference point in criminal justice training, corporate ethics discussions, and public health policy. It was studied not only as a crime, but as a moment of collective vulnerability. The investigation demonstrated how modern society could be disrupted without traditional weapons or direct confrontation, simply by exploiting trust. By the early 2000s, the case was officially considered cold, though never closed. Files remained accessible. Leads were still accepted. The Cook County Medical Examiner's Office maintained records, and federal agencies preserved evidence in the event that new information might emerge. Periodic media attention brought renewed interest, but no breakthrough followed. What lingered most strongly was the paradox at the heart of the case. The Tylenol murders led to sweeping improvements that saved countless lives in the years that followed. At the same time, the person responsible was never held accountable. The system adapted, but justice remained incomplete. For Chicago, the memory of those days in 1982 never fully faded. It became part of the city's history, a reminder of how quickly normal life can fracture, and how fragile trust can be when it's violated in the most unexpected way. The shelves of every pharmacy now carry silent evidence that lesson sealed layers standing between the public and a threat that once seemed unimaginable. The case endures not because of what was solved, but because of what remains unanswered. Somewhere within the thousands of pages of reports, interviews, and evidence logs lies a truth that has yet to surface. Until it does, the Chicago Tylenol murders remain one of America's most haunting reminders that even the safest routines can be altered in an instant.